Your ears are very important to us. Please hold on, and our program will begin shortly. The Soundcheck Podcast is coming up. Please continue to hold. Keep up with the Soundcheck Podcast and everything that's happening in the New Sounds empire. Just go to newsounds.org and follow us on social media. All of the icons are in the top right corner of the page. All of our other musicians are currently playing for other customers. Please stay with us, and someone will play for you in just a moment. From newsounds.org and our studios at WNYC, this is the Soundcheck Podcast, our series of live in-studio performances, streaming live on Facebook and YouTube. I'm John Schaefer. Lea Bertucci is a sax player, a composer, and a sound artist. In her work, what often sounds like a wall of sound is usually just Lea herself, with her saxophone, tape technology, resonant spaces, and sounds that exist in a gray area somewhere between music and noise. Her most recent album is called Resonant Field, and it has a fascinating backstory that we can get to. But Lea Bertucci is here to play for us, and she's going to do two longer pieces. So we're going to take a moment, Lea, to welcome you and to kind of set up the first thing you're going to do for us. It's great to have you here.
Yes, hi, John.
So, the piece you're going to play, called Warp and Weft, you have a saxophone here, but you also have a little mixer and a couple of little black boxes. So explain what we're about to experience.
Yeah, so it's electroacoustic music. So I'm processing my saxophone through some digital effects. The way that I go about processing my horn is to recreate the acoustics of the space that I recorded my latest album in. Mm-hmm. This was an extraordinary acoustic environment. It was a former grain elevator, so it's a cast concrete silo, about 18 feet wide and 150 feet tall.
So like incredible reverb, I would think.
Well, it was about like 12 seconds of decay. But on top of that, there was this really amazing kind of stereo delay effect happening as the sound bounced from one flat surface at the bottom to the flat surface at the top. Huh. So you would really get this very directional kind of delay on top of the resonance.
So obviously you're here in a radio studio, but you've brought a virtual silo with you electronically.
Yeah, I've done my best to recreate the sound of that space. Okay. Because a lot of the way that I was interested in exploring my instrument was through the lens of those acoustics. So finding different extended techniques that kind of excited certain frequencies of the space was really interesting to me.
Okay, quickly, when you say extended techniques, you mean things like key clicks and, overblowing, overtone, multiphonic effects, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, generally, extended technique can be defined as just playing your instrument incorrectly, which, of course, there's a lot of interesting freedom to doing that, you know? In my case, it was a lot of microtonal pitch bending, so lipping up and down. So when you do that in a really resonant space, you know, the sound exists for about 13 seconds after you make it. So when you're lipping up and down in a certain kind of progression, you can create these like overlapping microtonal harmonies.
All right. Well, I can't wait to see how this turns out. You want to play the piece for us?
Sure.
Lea Bertucci. This piece called Warp and Weft, there is a version recorded in this remarkable grain silo way upstate New York on her new album Resonant Field, but let's now hear a live performance of the piece here in our new sound studio. All right, then. That is Lea Bertucci with a live performance of her piece Warp and Weft. There is a somewhat different sounding version of that piece on Lea's new record called Resonant Field.
I would say that was an excerpt.
An excerpt, yeah.
Yeah.
On the record, you're using an alto saxophone. That's your primary instrument.
Yeah.
On the record and here, there are some impossibly low sounds that no matter what you're doing to an alto sax, I have to assume are coming from elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Although they're not the same low sounds as on the record.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? I mean, are you using samples as well as like looping and?
So usually my process entails making recordings of other instruments or sounding objects, and then processing them through my, I have a few different tape machines that I use to control the pitch and the speed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of the low sounds that you're hearing are of double bass, which is played by James Ilgen Fritz, and there's also some slowed down pipe organ.
So the things that sounded almost like whale song is probably the bass.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then I had to smile when you began at one point to introduce noise into the mix, because in the old days of tape delay,
right,
as the loop went around, each time it went around, you would accumulate more tape hiss, more noise.
Mm-hmm.
In the digital age, you actually have to insert that stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely an aesthetic.
Yeah. But one that, fits this kind of music, because historically that was a part of looping technology, was the introduction of noise into the signal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also, just like musically and compositionally speaking, noise, meaning, non-pitched kind of sound, has a really... It is very powerful.
Yeah.
It evokes a very strong reaction from listeners, and it's not for everyone. I think it takes a little bit more getting used to the idea of listening to chaotic, dense, non-pitched sounds. But I think that noise also as an aesthetic, as a characteristic, and as a tool compositionally speaks to the current state of affairs in our world.
Well, noise very often, nice pitched instruments in perfect harmony with each other are very pastoral sounding. Noise is very industrial sounding. So it is kind of a part and parcel of, of modern life, should be part of modern music, you would think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that because it is so difficult and outside of the norm for people, that listening to noise, it doesn't always, people don't always understand it. But that's why I think it's a very powerful tool.
Well, and also you've grounded it, because the saxophone loop is repeating as the, so there is something to hold on to. You're tethered musically, even as this non-pitched material is introduced.
I always think that dynamism, whether it is in terms of, quiet sounds or loud sounds, being able to juxtapose noise to pitched content, it really allows both things to have more effect.
Yeah. What was that noise? Because there's a moment on the record, and we heard maybe just a second of it here, where that noise almost sounded like it might have been birdsong.
Yeah. So that tape that I was playing specifically is some recordings that I made while I was traveling on the West Coast last year, of pelicans fighting over scraps.
Okay, so it is all right. Okay.
So I use a lot of like lo-fi field recordings as the source of my noise, and then I manipulate the tape machines to sort of, it's almost like a prepared instrument type of way of playing those recordings.
All right, so now the album, Resonant Field. You mentioned before playing Warp and Weft that this was done in this huge concrete grain silo near Buffalo. Is that right? Buffalo, New York?
Yeah, it's called Silo City, and it's in Buffalo, New York. And it was built in the early 1920s. And at the time, it was the largest cast concrete structure ever built, which is very interesting. And so that area was the terminus for all of the grain coming from the Midwest to be distributed along the East Coast. So this was a big industrial center. And since that time, it's gone through, that site has gone through some transformations. It sat abandoned for many years, and now is kind of becoming a site for artistic interventions. So Sarah Hennies also recorded a wonderful album there a couple years ago. She's a percussionist from Ithaca. So it is a site that's known for its extraordinary acoustics.
Like that, I don't know if you're familiar with the water cistern out in Washington State.
Oh, that Pauline Oliveros used for the deep listening. Yeah, so I mean, also this kind of process of site responsiveness or site specificity has a lot of precedence within the history of the avant-garde.
Well, and within your history, too, that was not the first time that you had gone into a space intending to activate the resonant frequency of a room through sound. Where does that interest come from?
That's been a part of my practice now for the last maybe 5 or 6 years. I've been focusing more on that. And I think it came from when I was a kid. I grew up in a town in upstate New York, and in this town there was a cement mine. And I remember going there when I was a kid and playing music there. And I had a very extraordinary experience because it was almost like I had never heard myself play before. It was only because the life of the sound existed for so long after the moment of sounding that I could hear in a different way. So I was really interested in that experience. And I guess also just a general interest in architecture has kind of led me down this path of inquiry.
Well, the funny thing is how much architecture and music in human history have been intertwined. You know, sacred spaces were churches, temples, whatever, were always the sites for music. And it would be a very different kind of music than what you would hear out in the fields because it was a different acoustic.
Right. The sound definitely takes on a much more celestial quality when it's in these super resonant spaces. But I'm also really interested in, doing more technical kind of stuff where I measure what the resonant frequency of the space is to find out like which harmonic series like actually tends to activate the room.
Okay, that's I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but since you mentioned the harmonic series, the saxophone is an equal tempered instrument. It plays in the same Western scale that we find on pianos and guitars.
Ideally.
So are you retuning somehow, or is that part of the extended techniques is to get at these alternate tunings?
Yeah, I mean, you can't tune a saxophone in just, right?
Right, in just intonation, yeah.
Yeah, so the closest approximation that you can do is like with your embouchure, like with your mouth, you can loosen or tighten on a single note, and you can create microtonal variations in a single pitch. So that's kind of one of the ways that I got around this. And also the other thing about when I was a kid and I was playing in these caves is I remember being very disappointed when I first picked up the saxophone when I was 9 that I could only play one note at a time.
Yeah.
And so playing in super resonant spaces allowed me to rethink the instrument as a polyphonic instrument.
Well, I think of people like Paul Horn recording in the Great Pyramid, or Paul Winter at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, people who spent their careers kind of exploring space and resonance and things like that. But then I also think of someone like Colin Stetson, the sax player who seems to be literally a one-man band. I mean, his saxophone is mic'd all over the place. He's got 4 different lines of music going simultaneously.
Yeah.
And, it seems like you've found yourself with a foot in both of those kind of musical camps.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to stick to a more like minimal approach with what I do. Stetson plays lots of notes.
Yes,
he's very virtuosic. And I think that I understand why people, make that comparison, but I think that my approach is a little bit more minimal.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in focusing on one thing and kind of trying to create like a meditative or contemplative space when I play.
Okay. Now, we heard just a tiny bit of the album Metal Ether, the patterns for alto, as we were beginning the session today. And that had, if not a minimal, at least a minimalist quality, the kind of pattern-based thing, which Colin does, which, we associate with Philip Glass and Terry Riley and Steve Reich.
Right.
So that,
But important to make the distinction betwing minimal and minimalist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 So but you can be both at the same time.
I can be both. I have to say I bristle a little bit at being categorized as like minimalist. I find a lot of minimalist music and music that's kind of descended from that tradition to be very insufferable. So.
Okay. Well, tell me about the title track from Resonant Field, which is the piece you're going to play next, because this is going to end up somewhere different from what's on the record, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to play kind of like a approximation of sounds from this record. We were talking before about by the time a record comes out, I'm already on to new interests and I'm already working with a host of new sounds. So whenever my setup changes, it's a little bit different from, the last thing that has come out. But what you will hear will be some tape collage, some more playing by James, and more noise, I guess.
All right. Lea Bertucci is our guest here in the New Sound studio. She will be performing live tomorrow night with James Ilgenfritz at Outpost in Ridgewood, Queens. The new record is called Resonant Field. Let's hear a version of the title track and then leading into Parts Unknown. Lea Bertucci, live on this edition of the Soundcheck Podcast. Once again, Lea Bertucci with a piece called Resonant Field. There is the full version of that is on the record of the same name, and leading into some, I mean, there's very little saxophone in that piece, Lea. So how much of the sound material that you're mixing, how much of that do you have full control over? How much of it is a surprise to you as it's happening?
I have some content that is pretty strict playback, kind of like a collage that I wouldn't call it a backing track because it's a little bit more fluid than that, and definitely not that consistent. With the tapes, it's kind of a somewhere in between improvisation. I guess it's like a structured improvisation. I cue the tapes up to places I know that I want the sounds,
right.
But there is always an element of indeterminacy when using these techniques.
Yeah.
So sometimes sounds pop out that I don't expect, so it kind of like keeps it a little bit interesting for me.
Yeah. So tomorrow night you're at Outpost in Ridgewood, Queens, playing with James Ilgenfritz.
That's right.
Will it be this setup plus his bass?
Yeah, so the set will be like it'll be like the full set, so it'll be about 40 minutes, and it will be kind of a mixture of what I just played and other material, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, Resonant Field, although it's a new record, as you alluded to before, was probably made a year or two ago?
Well, the first saxophone recordings were made in the summer of 2017, and then I kind of got busy with other projects, and I didn't really do anything with them until early this year. So
okay.
It was recorded, some of it was recorded quite a while ago.
Yeah. And was it this setup? Because as you mentioned before, when the setup changes, the music changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the saxophone stuff that was recorded in Buffalo was all acoustic, so there's actually no electronic processing on any of the instruments. So then I took those recordings into the studio, and I found moments that I thought were especially compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of edited those into discrete pieces and then added overdubs of other instruments and of electronics as well.
Right. So all of which is to say that, this is a kind of gradual unfolding process, this way of making music. It's, it's not just the music that changes. Very often it's the way of making music that develops as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty uninterested in composing music that is rote. Mm-hmm. I'm always interested in, like, my live set is kind of a constantly evolving thing. I'm always putting new sounds in, and I'm always taking things out. So it's really this like thing that's alive. It's an organism, and it's being influenced by things that are affecting me in real time. So, I'm really not the type of musician that just plays my songs.
Well, tomorrow night at Outpost, Lea Bertucci with James Ilgenfritz. The new record's called Resonant Field. Lea, it's been great having you with us. Thank you so much for coming in and playing for us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is Soundcheck.